I arrived in Briarwood, Idaho, on a chilly November evening. The town was a mere dot on the map, isolated and quiet, enveloped by dense pine forests that seemed to stretch infinitely. It was the kind of place where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the sky vast and empty, and silence hung heavily in the atmosphere. This was exactly what I needed, a refuge from my past. Having recently gone through a divorce, I felt drained by a job that had consumed me and a life that felt stifling. I stumbled upon Briarwood quite by chance, discovering a rental listing for a modest one-story house at the town's edge. It was affordable enough to feel like a blessing, with no neighbors flanking me, just the sound of whispering pines beyond the backyard fence. The landlord, Mr. Holloway, was an elderly man, thin and frail, with a handshake that felt like brittle twigs. He showed me around the house, saying little. Before I signed the lease, he handed me a sheet of paper detailing the town's rules. Briarwood Community Nighttime Rules, strictly enforced. The first rule read, keep all doors and windows locked from 2 a.m. to sunrise. No exceptions. 2. Do not answer the door if you hear knocking between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. There will be knocking. Ignore it. 3. If you hear whistling outside after 2 a.m., do not acknowledge it. Close your eyes, cover your ears, and do not react. 4. Under no circumstances should you go outside after 2 a.m., regardless of what you hear. 5. Do not speak about these rules to anyone who doesn't already know them. Initially, I had chuckled at what I thought was a small-town joke. Mr. Holloway's expression remained unchanged as he slid the paper toward me. Read them. Follow them, he insisted, his voice low yet unwavering. Or leave. Something in the way he delivered those words, combined with the unsettling stillness in his pale eyes, made me uneasy. I accepted the paper and moved in, diligently locking my doors. For the first few nights, nothing occurred. Briarwood felt like any other sleepy town, with empty roads even during the day. The people I encountered at the lone gas station spoke in whispers and avoided eye contact. I convinced myself that the rules were mere folklore, old superstitions meant to keep kids from sneaking out. But on the 5th night, I awoke at 2:13 a.m. to the sound of knocking. It wasn't polite, it was slow, deliberate, and heavy, one knock every 3 seconds. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as 3 more knocks echoed through the silence. I checked my phone, no messages, no missed calls. There was no reason for anyone to be at my door at this hour. Just as I felt a chill creep into my throat, the knocking ceased for 10 seconds, leaving only an eerie silence. Then, I heard it, a whistle, low and drifting through the trees, almost melodic but unsettling. It moved past my house, growing louder for a moment before fading into the woods. I lay frozen until dawn broke. When I finally stepped outside, I discovered bare human footprints in the frost. They led directly from my front door to the tree line, a chilling indication that I wasn't alone the previous night. Whatever it was had been aware of my presence. Sleep eluded me after that night. The knocking, the whistle, the footprints haunted my thoughts. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The footprints in the morning frost confirmed it. Yet when I examined them closely, they stopped abruptly at the edge of the trees, as if the person, or thing, had vanished into the woods without a trace. I spent most of that day on edge, flinching at every small sound. By noon, I could no longer bear being alone in the house, so I drove into town. Briarwood was small, featuring a diner, a gas station, a post office, and a general store that seemed frozen in the 1970s. As I walked through, the few people I encountered glanced at me but quickly averted their eyes, as if I were something they preferred to ignore. Inside the diner, the aroma of coffee and bacon should have been comforting, but instead, it felt oppressive, as if the entire place was shrouded in an invisible tension. I settled at the counter, where a woman in her mid-40s with graying hair and a name tag reading Maggie poured me coffee without a word. I hesitated before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" I ventured. She didn't look up. "Depends on what it is," she replied tersely. I pulled out the piece of paper Mr. Holloway had given me and slid it across the counter. "Are these rules serious?" Maggie paused mid-pour, her hand still. Slowly, she looked up at me. "You followed them last night." I swallowed hard. "Yeah." She nodded. "Good." I waited for her to elaborate, but she remained silent. Instead, she picked up the coffee pot and moved further down the counter, signaling that the conversation was over. I tried to press on. "Look, something was outside my house." It knocked, and then there was whistling. Maggie's grip on the coffee pot tightened. "Don't talk about it," she said, her voice low and urgent. I leaned closer, desperate for answers. "What the hell is it?" For a moment, it seemed like she might respond, but then she glanced over my shoulder, and her expression shifted to one of fear. I turned around to see an old man entering the diner. He was wiry, sun-leathered, and dressed in a flannel jacket, but it wasn't his appearance that sent a chill down my spine. It was his cold gray eyes, watching me with unsettling intensity. Maggie turned away, busying herself with plates that didn't need cleaning, while the other customers hunched lower over their meals. The tension in the room became suffocating. The old man approached and stopped just a foot away. "You're new," he said, his voice as rough as gravel. I nodded. "Yeah." "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked. I exhaled slowly. The man's jaw tensed as he sat beside me. "Listen carefully, boy. You follow the rules, you don't talk about it, and you sure as hell don't go looking for answers." My pulse raced in my throat. "Why not?" The man studied me closely, then leaned in, whispering, "Because if it knows you're listening, it listens back." Just then, the diner door swung open, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I heard something outside. A soft, distant whistle carried by the wind. The old man stiffened, then abruptly stood and strode out of the diner without another word. I sat frozen, my coffee untouched, heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't losing my mind. The town was aware of something, and whatever lurked outside knew I was there too. As I drove home, my thoughts tangled in confusion. Maggie's reaction, the old man's piercing gaze, and his chilling warning echoed in my mind. If it knows you're listening, it listens back. The moment I stepped inside, I locked the doors, feeling the house shrink around me, as if the walls had absorbed my anxiety. I couldn't shake the sense that moving here had been a mistake. Yet a part of me clung to the hope that this was just a local legend, a strange bit of folklore meant to deter people from wandering the woods at night. Maybe the knocking was just some drunk playing a prank, and the footprints were merely a trick of the morning frost. But the whistle? I had never heard anything like that before. I sat in my living room with every light blazing, waiting and listening. The paper containing the rules lay on the table beside me, and I read it repeatedly, tracing my fingers over each line. I paused at Rule 3. If you hear whistling outside after 2 a.m., do not acknowledge it. Close your eyes, cover your ears, do not react. What would happen if I did react? I glanced at the clock. 1:47 a.m., 13 minutes. My breath quickened, and my palms grew damp. I wasn't a superstitious person, but if I was going to live here, I needed to convince myself that this was all nonsense. So, at 1:59 a.m., I made a choice. I switched off all the lights and sat in the darkness, my heart pounding as I stared out at the moonlit trees. The silence felt oppressive, pressing against my skull. Every little noise, the house settling, the wind against the glass, made my skin crawl. Then, at exactly 2:07 a.m., it began. The knocking. My breath caught in my throat. It was just like before, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. I gripped the armrests of my chair, willing myself to remain still. I bit my lip hard enough to taste blood, my hands aching from the strain. Don't answer it. Don't move. Then, just like that, the knocking stopped. A thick silence enveloped the house, and then I heard it. The whistle. Soft at first, it was a distant, drifting melody that curled through the trees. It didn't sound human or natural, and it was getting closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart pounding. The sound grew louder, almost as if whatever was making it stood right outside my window. My breaths became shallow. Against every ounce of common sense, I opened my eyes. A shadow passed by the window, tall, thin, and wrong. It wasn't walking, it was gliding. It paused and slowly turned its head toward me. The whistling ceased, and my blood ran cold. It knew I was watching. In a panic, I lunged from the chair and dove onto the floor, pressing myself against the carpet with my hands clamped over my ears. I shut my eyes tight, praying that whatever was outside would just go away. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, so softly it could have been a figment of my imagination, a whisper slipped through the glass. "I see you." I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't stop shaking until the sun finally rose. I didn't leave the house. The next morning, I sat on the couch, my hands still trembling as my mind replayed the moment over and over. The shadow gliding past my window, the way it had turned to face me, and that chilling whisper, "I see you." It felt impossible, unreal, yet the moment had felt so tangible, as if something ancient and hungry had pressed against the glass, sensing me, marking me. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of my sleep-deprived mind, but then I saw them. The footprints were back. The frost on my porch had melted, but the bare, human-shaped prints remained, too long and leading directly up to my window. The worst part was that they didn't continue past it. They stopped right at the glass, as if whoever, or whatever, had just stood there, watching. I slammed the curtains shut, a rush of fear surging through me. I needed answers. By noon, I forced myself to leave the house, but paranoia clung to me, sinking its claws deep into my mind. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall, thin shape lurking at the edge of the road. I didn't want to believe it, but I felt the weight of it as soon as I reached town. I headed straight to the diner, where Maggie was wiping down the counter. The moment she spotted me, her expression darkened. "You looked, didn't you?" she muttered. My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" She sighed and put the rag down. "People like you always think it's just a story," she said, shaking her head. "You think we're just a backwoods town full of superstitious fools. But you don't understand. The rules aren't meant to scare you. They're there to keep it from noticing you." I leaned in closer. "What happens now?" Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're marked," she finally said. "It knows you. It will keep watching and testing you." My throat felt dry. "How do I stop it?" She hesitated, then slid something across the counter, a small jar of black salt. "Pour this in a circle around your house every night," she instructed. "It won't stop it, but it might keep it out." I tightened my grip on the jar. "Might." Maggie exhaled sharply, leaning closer. "It doesn't always follow the rules." Just then, I heard a chair scrape behind me. I turned to see the old man from yesterday, sitting in the corner, watching me silently. He tapped his fingers against the table in a slow, rhythmic pattern, just like the knocking. I stared at him, and he smiled faintly. I left the diner without finishing my coffee. That night, I followed Maggie's instructions precisely. I poured the salt in a circle, locked every door and window, and when the knocking began at 2:04 a.m., I didn't move. But this time, the knocking didn't stop, it continued relentlessly. Beneath the steady sound, I heard something else, fingernails dragging against the glass. The knocking wasn't just at the door anymore. It circled my house, echoing against the walls and windows. I curled up on the couch, gripping my knees, my heart racing. The salt was supposed to work. Maggie had assured me it would. Yet the knocking persisted. Then, at 2:37 a.m., it changed. The knocks became lighter, softer, like fingertips tapping on the glass. Suddenly, a voice emerged, not a whisper, not distant, but clear and right outside my window. "Let me in." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The voice sounded human, but there was something unsettling about it. Too calm, too smooth, as if someone were imitating speech without fully grasping it. I squeezed my eyes shut, repeating to myself, "Don't react, don't acknowledge." The voice came again, softer this time. "You're scared. I can hear you breathing." I covered my mouth with both hands, trying to stifle my fear. Then came the whistle, right outside the window, as if it was waiting for me to look. I almost gave in. I don't know what held me back, maybe sheer terror, but I kept my eyes closed, pressing my forehead to my knees, willing myself to stay still. Then the voice shifted, and I froze. It was my voice now, coaxing, "Come outside, just for a second." My blood ran cold. The knocking returned, harder this time, shaking the walls. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to move, to run, but I had nowhere to escape. Then, all at once, there was silence. I didn't move. A minute passed, then two. The room felt denser, as if the air had thickened. Finally, I heard footsteps, soft, barefoot, walking away. I didn't relax, not yet. One last whisper pierced the silence. "See you tomorrow." I remained curled in that position until sunrise. When morning came, I checked the house. The salt line around my home was untouched, not a single grain disturbed. But something else was wrong. My front door was unlocked. I knew for certain that I had locked it. Something had been inside last night, and I hadn't heard a thing. "Come in." I didn't leave the house that morning. I sat on the floor, staring at my unlocked front door, gripping a kitchen knife in my shaking hands. The salt line was untouched, which should have meant that nothing had entered. But the door was open, leaving me with two unsettling possibilities. Either I had forgotten to lock it or, worse, it had never been locked at all. I replayed the events of last night in my mind. The relentless knocking, the whispers, the thing outside mimicking my voice, and that chilling farewell. "See you tomorrow." I had followed the rules. I hadn't looked or reacted. Yet, it didn't seem to matter. This entity wasn't just testing me. It was toying with me, and a gut-wrenching feeling told me it was only beginning. By noon, I forced myself to drive back into town. I needed answers. Maggie wasn't at the diner, so I headed to the general store instead. A grizzled man in his 60s stood behind the counter, deep lines etched into his face. He eyed me as I entered. "You're the new one," he said. I hesitated. "Yeah." He wiped his hands on a rag. "You see it yet?" My throat felt dry. I heard it, and his expression darkened. "That's bad." I swallowed hard. "What is it?" He shook his head. "No one knows. It's always been here. My granddad talked about it, said the old ones, the ones who lived in these woods before us, had their own name for it. They left, and we stayed." I gripped the counter, desperation rising. "How do I stop it?" The man looked at me for a long moment before leaning in close, his voice low and filled with dread. "You can't." I opened my mouth to argue, but then I noticed something behind him on a bulletin board near the door. Missing persons flyers. At least a dozen, some old, dating back to the 90s, while a few appeared recent. The clerk followed my gaze. "Don't go outside," he warned, his tone grim. Not even once. Some of them went outside. I stared at the photos, a knot forming in my stomach. What about the others? The weight of the question hung in the air, but I didn't ask it aloud. I already knew the answer. They hadn't gone outside, yet they were gone anyway. That night, I locked every door, poured a fresh line of salt, and sat in my living room with the knife resting in my lap. I waited. At 2:11 a.m., the knocking began. At 2:19 a.m., the whistling followed. At 2:24 a.m., it escalated. I heard my own voice outside again. "You're not safe in there." I closed my eyes and covered my ears, trying to block it out. Then, at 2:37 a.m., I heard the closet door in the hallway creak open. I sat frozen on the couch, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The knocking had stopped, and the whistling faded, but now something was inside the house. The closet door had opened slowly, deliberately. My instincts screamed at me to run, to do anything, but I was paralyzed, my eyes fixed on the dark hallway, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then I heard it, a soft dragging sound, like bare feet sliding against the hardwood floor, moving closer. No, this wasn't supposed to happen. The rules were meant to keep it outside. The dragging sound halted just outside the living room. I forced myself to breathe as quietly as I could, my hands trembling around the knife. In the silence, a voice broke through, my voice. "I can see you." A wave of cold terror surged up my spine. It was close, right in the doorway. I wanted to scream, to look, but I resisted. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed my hands over my ears, repeating to myself, "Don't react, don't acknowledge." Then the floor creaked right in front of me. It was standing there, far too close. Warm breath brushed against my ear, whispering, "Why won't you look at me?" Something cold and thin grazed my arm, and I jerked back instinctively. My eyes flew open, but nothing was there. The room was empty, the hallway was empty, and the closet door remained ajar, but whatever had emerged was gone. Yet I wasn't relieved. Something felt off, as if the air had shifted. It was as if the house no longer belonged to me. Then I heard it, a final sound from the hallway. A whisper, not my voice this time, but something else, an unsettling chorus that sounded like 100 voices overlapping at once. "Tomorrow, you will open the door." The breath left my lungs. No, I wouldn't. I couldn't. But even as I thought it, a sickening pull formed in my chest, as if that idea had been implanted in me, a command buried deep in my mind. I sat awake until sunrise, trembling, because for the first time since moving here, I doubted my ability to resist. I didn't sleep, not that it was possible anymore. The moment dawn broke, I searched every inch of my house. The doors were still locked, the windows still latched, and the salt circle remained intact. Yet I could still feel it. Something had been inside last night. The air felt heavier, and the corners of each room appeared darker, shadows stretching just a bit too far. The walls seemed to breathe, and worst of all, I couldn't shake the thought of the door. The idea had taken root in my mind, winding around my thoughts like invasive vines. "Tomorrow, you will open the door." I didn't want to, but what if I already had? What if, in some dazed, half-conscious state, I had unwittingly let it in? The very thought made my stomach churn. I needed to escape. I grabbed my keys, threw open the front door, and nearly sprinted to my car. I didn't stop driving until I reached the gas station on the far side of town. Inside, an older man behind the counter looked up as I walked in. He took one glance at my face and sighed, as if he had seen this before. "You looked, didn't you?" I didn't need to answer. He gestured for me to come closer and lowered his voice. "You need to leave." I swallowed hard. "Leave town?" The man shook his head. "No, leave the house tonight." "Why?" He glanced at the windows, ensuring we weren't being overheard. "Because you can only fight it for so long." I gripped the counter, confused. "What does that mean?" He exhaled slowly. "No one opens the door willingly, but eventually, everyone does." A cold dread settled in my stomach. I stepped back, panic rising. "I don't understand." His expression darkened. "You will." That night, I tried everything. I barricaded the doors, pushed furniture against them, and piled salt on the windowsills, the floor, and every possible entry point in the house. None of it mattered. At 2:03 a.m., the knocking began, harder this time, more urgent. I pressed myself against the farthest wall, hands clamped over my ears. "Don't listen, don't react." The knocks shook the walls. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the whispers started, not outside, but right behind me. "The door is already open." I gasped and turned, but I was alone. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be happening. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to focus on my breathing. But then I felt it, a cold hand, thin fingers wrapping around mine. My breath caught as I felt my hand moving toward the doorknob, twisting it. I yanked back, stumbling away, my heart racing. I didn't move it. I whispered, desperate. But the doorknob continued to turn slowly, silently. Then came the click, the lock disengaged. The door began to swing open, revealing darkness. Not the kind that comes with night, but a void, an absence of everything. From within it, a tall, thin silhouette glided forward. My vision blurred, and my body felt foreign, as if it no longer belonged to me. It whispered inches from my face, "Time to go." Then the lights flickered on, sunlight pouring in. The door was shut, the salt untouched, and I found myself standing in the middle of my living room, my hand still hovering over the doorknob. I gasped for air and collapsed onto the floor, my body aching as if I had been in that position for hours. The whispers were gone, the knocking had stopped, but deep within my chest, I felt something worse, a sense of loss, as if a piece of me had been left behind on the other side of that door. I had no idea how much longer I could resist the urge to retrieve it. At sunrise, I packed my bags, not caring about breaking the lease. I just needed to leave. I threw everything I could into the trunk of my car, hands trembling, pulse racing in my ears. I didn't eat or shower, I just drove. I didn't stop until I was nearly 3 towns away, pulling into a cheap roadside motel, barely able to keep my hands steady enough to check in that first night away from Briarwood. I slept with the lights on, clutching the motel key tightly in my hand. There were no knocks, no whistling, no voices. I told myself it was over. Days turned into weeks. I moved to a new state, changed my number, convinced myself I had escaped. But something felt different now. At night, I still dreamed of the door I almost opened. Some nights, I saw the void waiting behind it. Other nights, the silhouette stepping forward. And sometimes, I saw myself in my living room, pulling that door open. Each time I woke, the door to my bedroom was always ajar. At first, I thought I was simply forgetting to close it. Then one night, I locked it and bolted it shut. When I awoke, the lock was still engaged, the bolt still in place, yet the door stood wide open. I resorted to sleeping in chairs, away from doors, but it didn't help. Last night, I heard it again. Not the knocking, not the whistling, but a whisper right beside me. "Come outside." For one horrifying moment, I was paralyzed with fear. My body nearly obeyed, my muscles tensed, and I felt myself leaning toward the door as if something was pulling me. I fought it and won, but next time, I might not. The truth is, you can't escape it. It doesn't stay in Briarwood or wait until 2 a.m. Once it knows you, it never stops watching. Sooner or later, I will open that door.